The desert wind carried nothing but dust and desperation across the badlands of Arizona territory. Red earth stretched endlessly toward jagged mountains that clawed at the cloudless sky, their peaks worn smooth by centuries of scorching sun and bitter cold. The railroad tracks cut through this desolation like a scar, leading to the small town of Bitter Creek, a place where dreams came to die and men learned the true meaning of survival. Through the shimmering heat waves, a lone figure appeared on horseback. The rider swayed in the saddle, small hands gripping the reins with desperate determination. As the horse drew closer to the scattered buildings that marked civilization's stubborn foothold in this wilderness, it became clear this was no ordinary traveler. Elizabeth Whitfield had never imagined her wedding day would end with her fleeing across the desert in a stolen dress. The ivory silk, once pristine and carefully fitted by Boston's finest seamstresses, now hung heavy with sweat and dust. Her elaborate hairpins had long since fallen away, leaving her dark hair to whip freely in the hot wind. Each movement of the horse sent sharp pains through her legs. She had never ridden astride before today, had never done many things before today. The morning had begun so differently. She remembered standing before the mirror in her father's mansion, watching as her mother fastened the pearl buttons down her spine. Each button had felt like another bar on a cage she hadn't realized was closing around her until it was almost too late. Harold Morrison waited at the church, 43 years old, with cold gray eyes and hands that had built a fortune in railroad speculation. Her father spoke of the match as a business merger. Her mother whispered of duty and sacrifice. No one spoke of love. The virgin bride rode into town to escape love, Elizabeth whispered to herself. The words cracked and dry on her lips. But that wasn't quite right, was it? She wasn't escaping love. She was escaping its absence, fleeing from a life that would drain her soul as surely as this desert sun was draining her body. The memory of her escape played through her mind as the town grew larger. She had claimed a need for privacy before the ceremony, sending away her attendants. The window had been her salvation, a trellis strong enough to bear her weight. Though the roses had torn at her dress and skin, the stable boy, young Timothy, had been easy enough to bribe with her ruby earrings. He'd saddled the gentlest mare without questions, though his eyes had been wide with shock. Now, hours later, that gentle mare was near collapse. Elizabeth could feel the animal's labored breathing, could see the foam gathering at the corners of its mouth. Guilt twisted in her stomach alongside the hunger and thirst. She had never meant to cause suffering to any creature, but desperation had made her selfish. The landscape around her was unlike anything she had known in Boston. There, nature had been confined to manicured gardens and tree-lined avenues. Here, it sprawled raw and untamed, beautiful in its brutality. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in silent judgment. Scrub brush clung to life in the sandy soil, thorny and resilient. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily, waiting for something to die. Elizabeth's throat burned with thirst. The small canteen Timothy had tied to the saddle had been empty for hours now. She had rationed it carefully at first, then gulped the last drops in a moment of panic when she'd thought she heard horses following. But there had been no pursuit, not yet. Perhaps her father was too shocked, or perhaps Harold Morrison was deciding whether a runaway bride was worth the trouble. She prayed for the latter. The weight of her decision pressed down upon her like the desert heat. Every mile she traveled took her further from everything she had ever known. Her life in Boston hadn't been unhappy. Exactly. She'd had beautiful dresses, educated companions, evenings at the opera, but it had been a life lived in half measures. Every action scrutinized, every word weighed for propriety. The thought of continuing that existence as Mrs. Harold Morrison bearing his children, hosting his business associates, growing old in quiet desperation had finally broken something inside her. Her mother would be weeping now, worried more about the family's reputation than her daughter's happiness. Her father would be calculating the business losses, perhaps already drafting telegrams to smooth things over with Morrison. and Elizabeth. She was here in this God-forsaken wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hope so fragile she dared not examine it too closely. The mare stumbled, nearly sending Elizabeth tumbling to the ground. She managed to keep her seat, but barely. The poor animal couldn't continue much longer. Bitter Creek was close now. She could make out individual buildings, could see figures moving along what passed for a main street. Fear and relief warred in her chest. She needed water, food, rest, but she also needed to remain hidden, to disappear into this vast territory where her father's influence might not reach. As she guided the exhausted horse toward the town's edge, Elizabeth caught her reflection in a water trough. The woman staring back was a stranger, wild-haired, sunburned, with something fierce and desperate in her eyes. The pampered Boston belle was gone, but what had taken her place? She didn't know yet, but for the first time in her 22 years, she was eager to find out. The virgin bride had indeed ridden into town, not to escape love, but to escape a loveless life. What she would find in Bitter Creek, salvation or damnation, remained to be seen. But as she slid from the saddle on trembling legs, as she led the poor mare to water and watched it drink deeply, Elizabeth Whitfield knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The cage door had been opened, and she would die before letting it close again. Bitter Creek was everything Boston was not: raw, loud, and utterly without pretense. The main street was little more than a wide dirt path, churned to dust by countless boots, hooves, and wagon wheels. False-fronted buildings lined both sides, their sun-bleached wood facades trying desperately to appear grander than the rough structures behind them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and oppressive. Elizabeth stood at the edge of town, still clutching the mare's reins with hands that trembled from exhaustion. The saloon's tinny piano music drifted through the air, mixing with rough laughter and the occasional crash of breaking glass. Men lounged in the shadows of covered walkways, their eyes following her with predatory interest. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The dress that had cost more than most of these men would see in a year now marked her as clearly as a sign around her neck: outsider, easy prey, trouble. She pulled the torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to hide the ivory silk beneath. Her throat burned with thirst, but the thought of entering any of these establishments alone made her stomach clench with fear. "Ma'am?" A young boy, perhaps 12 years old, approached cautiously. His clothes were patched but clean, his face earnest beneath a layer of desert dust. "You look like you need help. My ma runs the boarding house down the street. It's respectable-like." Elizabeth nearly wept with relief. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. Could you show me?" The boy, who introduced himself as Samuel, took the mare's reins and led them past the saloon, past a general store with grimy windows, past men who spat tobacco juice into the street without care for where it landed. The boarding house sat at the far end of the main thoroughfare, a 2-story structure that looked slightly less weathered than its neighbors. A painted sign read, "Mrs. Dottie's Rooms. Clean beds. Fair prices." Mrs. Dottie herself appeared in the doorway before they reached it, as if she had some sixth sense for arriving travelers. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes took in Elizabeth's bedraggled state, the expensive dress, the absence of luggage, and drew their own conclusions. "Samuel, take that poor creature to the stable and see she's watered and fed." "Mrs." Dottie commanded. "Tell Marcus to put it on my account." She turned to Elizabeth. "As for you, child, you look about ready to drop. Come inside before you faint in my doorway and give the gossip something more to chatter about." The boarding house's interior was sparse but clean, a blessed relief from the dust and chaos outside. Elizabeth followed Mrs. Dottie up narrow stairs to a small room at the back. It contained only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair, but to Elizabeth it looked like paradise. "Now then, Mrs.," Dottie said, pouring water from a pitcher into the basin. "I run a respectable establishment, but I'm not fool enough to turn away someone in genuine need. You've got the look of trouble about you, but not the kind that comes from wickedness, running from something. I'd wager." Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. She drank greedily from the cup Mrs. Dottie offered, the cool water feeling like salvation itself. "I won't ask questions you're not ready to answer," the older woman continued. "But Bitter Creek isn't kind to women alone, especially ones who look like they've got money, or had money. That dress might as well be a target painted on your back." "I have some coins," Elizabeth said quietly, "hidden in the dress. Not much, but enough for a few days' room and board." "Mrs." Dottie studied her for a long moment. "What you need is different clothes and a story that won't draw attention. Lucky for you, I've got both. My daughter left some things when she married and moved to California. Plain stuff, but clean and mended. As for a story..." She paused, thinking. Widow heading west to live with relatives. Common enough to be believable. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I was young once, and I know the look of a woman who's chosen the unknown over the unbearable. Now, let's get you cleaned up and fed. Tomorrow's troubles can wait." An hour later, Elizabeth barely recognized herself. The simple calico dress and worn boots transformed her from runaway Boston bride to just another woman trying to survive in the territories. She sat in Mrs. Dottie's kitchen, forcing herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. When the back door swung open, the man who entered had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. Elizabeth's breath caught. He was unlike the refined gentleman of her acquaintance, all sharp angles and coiled strength, like a wolf forced to walk among sheep. Dark hair fell past his collar, and his face bore the deep tan of a life lived under open skies. But it was his eyes that held her gray as storm clouds, carrying shadows that spoke of hard-won wisdom and harder losses. A thin scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, and his clothes, while clean, bore the wear of constant use. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested violence held in careful check. This was a dangerous man, Elizabeth realized, but perhaps not a cruel one. "Jake," Mrs. Dottie said calmly, as if mysterious men appeared in her kitchen regularly. "This is Mrs. Smith. She'll be staying with us for a spell." Jake Thornton's gaze moved over Elizabeth with an assessment that made her spine stiffen. She saw him note her soft hands, the way she held herself despite the common clothes, the fear she couldn't quite hide. His expression revealed nothing, but she sensed he saw through their fiction as easily as looking through window glass. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low, roughened by whiskey or dust or both. "Oh, Mr. Thornton brings me fresh game when he's in town," Mrs. Dottie explained. "Keeps my guests fed and my costs down." Jake set a bundle on the table wrapped in cloth. It leaked small spots of blood. "2 rabbits," he said. "Caught them this morning up near Eagle Ridge." The conversation continued around Elizabeth, but she found herself watching Jake from beneath lowered lashes. There was something about him, a stillness that reminded her of the desert itself, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. When he moved to leave, their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something flicker there, recognition, perhaps, though not of her identity, recognition of a kindred spirit. Maybe another soul running from something, or towards something, or both. "You planning to stay long in Bitter Creek, Mrs. Smith?" he asked, and she heard the slight emphasis on her assumed name. "I haven't decided," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Well, it's a hard place for those not used to it, but then again..." He paused, his scarred face unreadable. "Sometimes the hard places are where we find what we're really made of." After he left, Mrs. Dottie busied herself with the rabbits, but Elizabeth could feel the woman's knowing gaze. "Jake's a good man," she said finally. "Damaged, like most out here, but good. Keeps to himself mostly. Has a place outside town. Lost his wife 3 years back, Indian raid, though he doesn't blame them for it like most would. Says there's enough hate in the world without adding to it." Elizabeth helped clean up, her mind churning. She had fled one cage only to find herself in another kind of wilderness entirely. But there was something about this place, these people, that felt more real than anything in her previous life. Even the danger felt honest, at least here. The threats didn't hide behind polite smiles and social graces. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the saloon down the street, Elizabeth thought about gray eyes and scarred faces, about kindness given without expectation of return, about the price of freedom and whether she had the strength to pay it. Tomorrow she would need to make decisions, find work, create a new identity, learn to survive in this unforgiving place. But tonight, for the first time in months, she fell asleep without the weight of dread in her chest. She had taken the first step into an unknown future, and while it terrified her, it also made her feel more alive than she had ever been. The virgin bride had found her way to Bitter Creek, and perhaps, just perhaps, she might find herself here too. The trouble started 3 days later at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Elizabeth had ventured out to purchase supplies at the general store, keeping her head down and speaking only when necessary. She was learning the rhythms of Bitter Creek, when to walk the streets, which men to avoid, how to blend into the background of frontier life. But some lessons came harder than others. She was passing the saloon when Bill Hackett stumbled out, reeking of whiskey and days-old sweat. He was a thick-set man with mean eyes and hands like ham hocks, known for causing trouble when drunk, which was most of the time. His gaze fixed on Elizabeth with the focus of a predator scenting prey. Well, he slurred, blocking her path. "Mrs. Smith, ain't it funny thing? You don't look like no widow to me. Too pretty, too—" His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Untouched. Please let me pass," Elizabeth said quietly, trying to step around him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. She'd learned that showing fear in Bitter Creek was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Hackett grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Now, don't be unfriendly. Just trying to make conversation with a pretty lady. Maybe buy you a drink, show you some hospitality." The lady said to let her pass. Jake Thornton's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. He stood 10 feet away, his stance deceptively casual, but Elizabeth could see the tension coiled in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the Colt on his hip. Hackett's grip tightened. "This ain't your concern. Thornton, find your own woman." "Everything all right is my concern when it happens in front of me," Jake replied. His gray eyes never left Hackett's face. "Now, you can let go of Mrs. Smith and walk away, or we can settle this another way. Your choice, but choose quick. My patience ain't what it used to be." The street had gone quiet. Men stopped to watch from doorways and windows, sensing violence in the air like the promise of a storm. Elizabeth could feel Hackett's hand trembling slightly, whether from drink or fear. She couldn't tell. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Hackett snarled. "Just 'cause you got lucky in a few gunfights. But luck runs out. Thornton, maybe today's the day." "Maybe," Jake agreed mildly, "but not for me." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Elizabeth held her breath, acutely aware that she stood between two armed men with whiskey and pride making decisions for them. Then Hackett shoved her aside roughly, sending her stumbling against a hitching post. His hand went for his gun, but Jake was faster. The Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, the movement so smooth it seemed like the natural extension of thought into action. The barrel centered on Hackett's chest before the drunk man's weapon had cleared leather. "Don't," Jake said simply. Hackett froze, his face going pale beneath the grime. Slowly, Carefully, he let his hand fall away from his weapon. "Smart choice." Jake said. He didn't holster his gun. Not yet. "Now apologize to the lady." "What?" "You heard me. Apologize for putting your hands on her." Hackett's face flushed dark red. To be called out was one thing, but to be humiliated in front of the whole town was another. But the gun in Jake's hand didn't waver, and everyone knew Jake Thornton didn't make idle threats. "Sorry, ma'am," Hackett mumbled, not meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "Now get out of my sight," Jake said. "And Hackett, if I see you bothering Mrs. Smith again, we won't have another conversation about it." Hackett lurched away, pushing through the gathered crowd. Slowly, the normal sounds of the town resumed, though Elizabeth could feel the curious stares following them. Jake holstered his weapon and moved to where Elizabeth stood, still gripping the hitching post. "You hurt." She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her arm throbbed where Hackett had grabbed her, and her legs felt unsteady as water. "Come on," Jake said. "Let's get you back to Mrs. Dottie's." He didn't touch her, but walked beside her, his presence a shield against any further harassment. Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the violence she just witnessed with the gentle way he'd defended her. "Thank you," she finally managed as they neared the boarding house. "No need for thanks. Hackett's been building to something like that for a while. Better it happened when someone could stop it." "Still, you didn't have to intervene. It could have gone badly for you." Jake's scarred face showed the hint of a smile. "Could have, but I've found that the things we don't do haunt us more than the things we do, even when they're dangerous." They stopped at Mrs. Dottie's gate. Elizabeth knew she should go inside, but found herself reluctant to end this strange conversation. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be exactly the kind of trouble this town doesn't need." Jake studied her for a long moment. "Maybe you are trouble," he said finally, "but not the kind that deserves what Hackett had in mind. Besides," he paused, looking out toward the desert, "I know what it's like to be running from something, to need a place to stop and breathe without someone asking questions you can't answer." "I'm not," Elizabeth began, then stopped. What was the point of denying it? This man saw too clearly. "You don't owe me any explanations." Jake said, "Your secrets are your own, but a word of advice Bitter Creek has a way of stripping away pretense. Whatever you're hiding from, it'll find you eventually. Better to be ready when it does." He touched his hat brim and turned to go, but Elizabeth called after him. "Mr. Thornton, would you teach me?" He turned back, eyebrow raised. "To shoot," she clarified, heat rising in her cheeks. "To defend myself, I can pay not much, but something." Jake was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then he nodded slowly. "Day after tomorrow, early morning, I'll come by and fetch you. Wear something you can move in, and leave the money talk be. Some things shouldn't be transactions." That night, Elizabeth lay awake thinking about gray eyes and steady hands, about violence controlled and kindness unexpected. She thought about Jake's words that Bitter Creek stripped away pretense. Maybe that's what she needed. Maybe that's why she'd run here, to this hard place where survival meant more than society's rules. Mrs. Dottie knocked softly and entered with a cup of tea. "Heard about what happened today," she said, settling her bulk in the room's single chair. "Jake Thornton's not a man to cross, but he's also not a man to take up causes lightly. You must have made an impression." "He's just being kind," Elizabeth said, though she wondered if that was true. "Maybe," Mrs. Dottie allowed. "But Jake's kind of kindness comes with sharp edges. He's been alone since Mary died, keeps people at arm's length. The fact that he's willing to teach you anything?" She trailed off meaningfully. "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said. "His wife." Mrs. Dottie's face softened. "Mary Thornton was sunshine in a dark place. Half Mexican, which caused its own problems. But Jake never cared about that. They were building a good life out at his ranch. Then the Apache came through. Raiding, Jake was in town getting supplies. By the time he got back, she shook her head. He tracked them for days, they say, but when he found them, he didn't take revenge. Said Mary wouldn't have wanted more blood spilled in her name. He's been different since then. Harder, lonelier. Elizabeth absorbed this information, understanding a little better the shadows in Jake's eyes. They were alike. She realized both carrying losses, both trying to find a way forward in this unforgiving land. He's a good man, Mrs. Dottie continued. But he's also a dangerous one. That combination can be compelling to a woman, especially one running from her own ghosts. Just be careful, child. Hearts break as easily out here as anywhere else. Sometimes easier. After Mrs. Dottie left, Elizabeth stood at her window looking out at the desert. Somewhere out there was Jake's ranch, where he lived with his memories and his grief. Tomorrow she would return to being Mrs. Smith, the fictional widow. But day after tomorrow, she would learn to shoot a gun from a man who understood that sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. "Never expect the cowboy rode straight into her bed," she whispered, remembering the fortune teller's words from years ago that had seemed like nonsense at the time. But now she wondered if some futures cast their shadows backward, if some meetings were written in the stars long before the players even knew their parts. She pulled the thin curtain closed and prepared for bed, her arm still bearing the bruises from Hackett's grip. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new deceptions to maintain, but it would also bring the promise of learning to defend herself, of becoming someone who could survive in this harsh land, and perhaps, though she hardly dared think it, it would bring another chance to look into those storm-gray eyes and find understanding there. The desert taught its lessons without mercy. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth learned that survival in the territories demanded more than just courage. It required a complete transformation of who she had been. Each dawn brought new challenges as she adapted to life in Bitter Creek, her soft hands growing calloused, her pampered body learning the rhythm of hard work. Jake arrived as promised that first morning, leading an extra horse. He'd taken her out past the town limits to a canyon where the sound of gunfire wouldn't disturb anyone. The weight of the Colt .45 in her hands had been shocking, so much heavier than she'd expected, so much more real. "It's not about being fast," he'd told her, positioning her stance. "It's about being steady. Sure, anyone can pull a trigger. The question is whether you can live with what comes after." She'd flinched at the first shot, the recoil jarring her entire arm. But Jake had been patient, correcting her grip, her stance, her breathing. By the end of that morning, she could hit a tin can at 10 paces. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The shooting lessons became routine 3 mornings a week, always early before the heat grew unbearable. But they were just one part of her education. Elizabeth learned to haul water from the well behind Mrs. Dottie's, her shoulders screaming at the weight of the buckets. She learned to bank a fire properly, to mend clothes with tiny, careful stitches, to judge the weather by the color of the dawn sky. At the boarding house, she helped Mrs. Dottie with cooking and cleaning in exchange for reduced rent. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd ever done in Boston, but there was a satisfaction in it that surprised her. When she served meals to the boarders, mostly miners and cowboys passing through, she felt useful in a way she never had while planning dinner parties for Harold Morrison's business associates. Jake often took his evening meals at Mrs. Dottie's when he was in town, always sitting at the same corner table where he could watch both doors. He didn't say much, but Elizabeth found herself aware of his presence in a way that disturbed her. She'd catch herself smoothing her hair before entering the dining room, or saving the best cut of meat for his plate. "You're playing with fire, child," Mrs. Dottie warned one evening as they washed dishes. "Jake Thornton ain't the marrying kind anymore. That part of him died with Mary." But Elizabeth wasn't thinking of marriage. She wasn't sure what she was thinking, only that when Jake's eyes met hers across the crowded dining room, something flickered between them, understanding. perhaps, or recognition of shared pain. The hard land was working its changes on her body as well as her spirit. The sun darkened her skin despite her bonnet, and the physical labor carved new lines of muscle in her arms. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman looking back. Gone was the pale, delicate Boston belle. In her place stood someone leaner, harder, more real. One afternoon, while hanging laundry behind the boarding house, she heard familiar hoofbeats. Jake rounded the corner leading a pack horse laden with supplies. He'd been gone for a week, checking on his ranch, and Elizabeth was alarmed by how much she'd missed his quiet presence. Mrs. Smith," he greeted, dismounting with the fluid grace that marked everything he did. "Mr. Thornton," she continued, pinning sheets to the line, though her hands trembled slightly. "How was your trip?" "Productive. Lost some cattle to wolves, but the rest are healthy." He studied her, noting the changes the past weeks had wrought. "You're looking more at home here." "I'm trying," she admitted, "though some days I wonder if I'll ever truly belong." "Belonging isn't about where you're from," Jake said, helping her with a heavy quilt. "It's about choosing to stay when things get hard, about finding something worth fighting for." Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same corner of fabric, and Elizabeth felt heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Jake went still, and for a moment she thought he might say something more. Then he stepped back, the moment broken. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a leather holster, well made, but plain. "If you're going to carry a weapon, you need a proper rig for it. This was Mary's." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Jake, I couldn't—" "She'd want it used," he interrupted. "Mary was practical that way. Didn't believe in keeping useful things locked away." The holster was smaller than a man's, designed to ride on a woman's hip. The leather was soft with use, but well-maintained. Elizabeth could see where it had been mended in places, each repair done with careful attention. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. Jake cleared his throat. "There's something else. Word is Harold Morrison's been asking questions in Tucson, hiring men to look for a runaway bride. Thought you should know." The blood drained from Elizabeth's face. She'd known this day would come, but she'd hoped for more time. "How long before they come here?" "Week, maybe 2. Depends on how thorough they're being." Jake's gray eyes were steady on hers. "You could run again, head to California, maybe, or up to Colorado." "I'm tired of running," Elizabeth heard herself say. "This is where I stopped. This is where I'll stand." Something shifted in Jake's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "Then you'll need more than shooting lessons. You'll need friends, allies. Lucky for you, Bitter Creek takes care of its own, and you're one of ours now." That evening, Elizabeth sat in her room with Mary Thornton's holster across her lap. She thought about the woman who'd worn it before her, brave enough to love across racial lines, strong enough to build a life in this unforgiving land. She thought about Jake, carrying his grief like a physical weight but still finding kindness to offer a stranger. Outside her window, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red, painting the desert in shades of fire. Somewhere out there, men were looking for her, ready to drag her back to a life she'd rather die than live. But here, in this rough town on the edge of nowhere, she'd found something worth defending. She strapped on the holster, adjusting it until it sat comfortably on her hip. The weight of it felt right, like armor she hadn't known she needed. Tomorrow she would continue learning to survive hauling water, cooking meals, practicing her aim. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had come to Bitter Creek as Elizabeth Whitfield, pampered and powerless. She would face whatever came as Elizabeth Smith, transformed by the desert and tempered by loss. The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear desert air. Elizabeth watched them appear one by one, each a point of light in the vast darkness. She thought of Jake's words that belonging was about choosing to stay when things got hard. She'd made her choice. Now all that remained was to see if she was strong enough to live with it. A coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. Once, the sound would have frightened her. Now it seemed almost like a welcome, a recognition from the wild land that she was learning to call home. She closed the curtains and prepared for bed, her hand unconsciously checking the position of the holster. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in survival. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was a fragile thing, as delicate as desert flowers after rain. But it was real, and in this hard place where pretense meant nothing and strength was the only currency that mattered, real was enough. The transformation was far from complete, but Elizabeth Smith was becoming someone who could survive whatever storms were heading her way. And perhaps, though she hardly dared think it, someone worthy of the quiet respect she sometimes glimpsed in a pair of storm-gray eyes. The riders came on a Tuesday, just as the afternoon heat was beginning to break. Elizabeth was drawing water from the well when she heard the thunder of hooves too many to be casual travelers, too purposeful to be anything but trouble. Her hand went instinctively to the colt at her hip, Jake's training taking hold before conscious thought. "Mrs." Dottie appeared in the doorway, her weathered face grim. "Get inside, child, now!" But Elizabeth remained where she stood, watching as 6 men rode down Main Street in a cloud of dust. At their head was a man she recognized despite never having seen him before. Luther Crane, Harold Morrison's enforcer. His reputation had reached even Boston's polite circles, though always in whispers, tall and lean, with dead eyes and a face like a hatchet. He was the kind of man rich men hired when law and conscience were inconveniences. The riders dismounted at the Silver Dollar, but Crane's gaze swept the street methodically, cataloging every face, every movement. When his eyes found Elizabeth by the well, she saw recognition flicker there. Not of her specifically, the calico dress and sun-darkened skin had changed her that much, but of something that didn't belong. "Trouble's here," Jake's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing slightly in front of her like a shield. "Been watching them from the ridge? They've got the look of men hunting something specific." "Someone?" Elizabeth corrected quietly. "They're hunting someone." Jake's jaw tightened. "Get inside. Let Mrs. Dottie hide you in the root cellar until—" "No." The word came out stronger than she'd intended. "I'm done hiding. If they want to find Elizabeth Whitfield, let them look at Elizabeth Smith and see if they recognize her." "Don't be a fool," Jake said harshly. "Pride won't stop a bullet. Neither will a root cellar if they search the place." Elizabeth met his eyes steadily. "You said Bitter Creek takes care of its own. Let's see if that's true." The news spread through town like wildfire. Within an hour, everyone knew about the strangers asking questions, showing a photograph of a Boston belle who bore a passing resemblance to their Mrs. Smith. The transformation was remarkable. Shopkeepers suddenly developed poor memories. Miners became selectively deaf. And even the saloon girls claimed they'd never seen anyone matching the description. But Luther Crane wasn't a man easily discouraged. He set up court in the Silver Dollar, buying drinks and spreading Morrison's money around like seed corn. The price on Elizabeth's head was substantial, $500 for information leading to her return. A fortune in a town where men killed each other over card games worth 10. "Someone will talk," Elizabeth said that evening, pacing her small room like a caged animal. "Money like that loosens tongues." Jake leaned against the doorframe, having refused to leave her unguarded. "Maybe, but you underestimate how much this town hates outsiders telling us what to do." Crane's throwing his weight around, making threats. "That's not how you win friends in Bitter Creek." As if to prove his point, they heard raised voices from the street. Looking out the window, they saw Crane backing Bill Hackett against a wall, one hand twisted in the drunk's shirt. Even from a distance, they could hear Hackett's protests that he didn't know nothing about no runaway bride. Hackett's many things, but he's our son of a bitch, Jake murmured. Crane just made his second mistake. What was his first coming here at all? The standoff continued for 3 days. Crane and his men searched systematically, checking every building, questioning every resident. They found nothing but closed faces and claimed ignorance. Elizabeth continued her daily routines, refusing to cower, though she never went anywhere without the Colt. On the third night, things came to a head. Elizabeth was serving dinner in the boarding house when Crane himself walked in, his spurs ringing against the floorboards like death knells. The dining room fell silent. "Evening, folks," Crane said, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm looking for Mrs. Dottie. Heard she might have some information about a missing person I'm trying to locate." Mrs. Dottie emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "I run a boarding house, Mr. Crane, not an information bureau. You want to eat, sit down. Otherwise, you can leave." Crane's dead eyes swept the room, lingering on Elizabeth. She forced herself to continue pouring coffee, though her hands wanted to shake. "You," he said. "What's your name?" "Smith," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Mrs. Smith." "Funny thing," Crane mused, moving closer. "You remind me of someone. Can't quite place it. Maybe if you took off that bonnet." Jake's chair scraped back as he stood. "The lady's trying to work. Let her be. And you are someone who doesn't like strangers bothering our women folk," Jake replied. Around the room, other men were standing too. Samuel's father, the blacksmith, even the store clerk who barely spoke above a whisper. The message was clear. Elizabeth Smith was under their protection. Crane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting town you have here. Very loyal." He reached into his coat, and several hands moved toward weapons, but he only pulled out the photograph. "Last chance. Mrs. Smith, you sure you've never seen this woman?" Elizabeth looked at the photograph, her own face staring back at her, pale and perfect and utterly foreign to who she'd become. "Can't say I have," she said calmly. "That lady looks like she's never done an honest day's work in her life. We don't get many of those in Bitter Creek." For a long moment, Crane studied her. Elizabeth could feel him weighing the evidence, the rough hands, the sun-damaged skin, the way she stood like someone accustomed to hard labor. She saw the moment he dismissed her as a possibility and nearly sagged with relief. "My mistake," he said finally. "But if anyone does see her..." He left the threat hanging and strode out. The room remained tense until Jake moved to the window, watching. "They're heading back to the saloon," he reported. Then, quietly enough that only Elizabeth could hear, "Well played, but this isn't over." He was right. That night, Elizabeth was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Her window exploded inward in a shower of shards as something heavy flew through it. By the time she reached it, Colt in hand, she could see riders disappearing into the darkness. The object was a piece of wood with words burned into it. "We know who you are. Come quietly or the town burns." Jake arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from his post outside. He read the message, his face hardening. "Crane's done playing nice." "I should go," Elizabeth said, her voice hollow. "I can't let them hurt innocent people because of me." "You think giving yourself up will stop them?" Jake turned on her, angry now. "Men like Crane don't leave witnesses. They'll burn the town anyway, just to teach a lesson about harboring fugitives." Mrs. Dottie appeared with several other townspeople. Word spread quickly in Bitter Creek, and within minutes, a war council had formed in the boarding house kitchen. The consensus was unanimous. They wouldn't hand over one of their own to outsiders, no matter the threat. "Besides," the sheriff said, surprising everyone by actually showing up, "threatening to burn down a town is a hanging offense in the territory. Mr. Crane just made this official business." Plans were made quickly. The women and children would be moved to the old mine for safety. The men would set up defensive positions. It wasn't the first time Bitter Creek had faced down would-be tyrants. And it wouldn't be the last. Elizabeth tried to protest, to argue that this wasn't their fight, but Jake cut her off. "You chose to stay," he said simply. "That made it our fight. Now stop arguing and start loading ammunition. Dawn's coming, and with it, Crane." As she worked beside the others, preparing for a battle she'd never imagined fighting, Elizabeth felt something fundamental shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something stronger: determination. She'd run from Harold Morrison and the life he represented. She'd run all the way to this dusty town on the edge of nowhere. But she wouldn't run anymore. The stars were fading as the eastern sky began to lighten. Somewhere out there, Luther Crane was preparing his assault, confident that money and violence would get him what he wanted. He was about to learn that in Bitter Creek, loyalty was worth more than gold, and courage was the only currency that truly mattered. Elizabeth checked her weapon one more time, Mary Thornton's holster sitting naturally on her hip now. The virgin bride who had ridden into town was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by the desert, tempered by hardship, and ready to fight for the home she'd found in the most unlikely of places. Dawn broke blood red over Bitter Creek, painting the desert in shades of violence to come. Elizabeth crouched behind overturned water barrels outside the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The Colt in her hand was steady, though Jake's training had seen to that. Around her, the men of Bitter Creek had transformed the sleepy Main Street into a fortress of makeshift barricades and strategic positions. The attack came with the full light of morning. Luther Crane's men rode in hard from the east, using the rising sun to blind the defenders. Gunfire erupted like thunder, shattering the desert quiet. Elizabeth's world narrowed to the rhythm of combat aim. Fire, duck, reload. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils as bullets whined overhead, splintering wood and shattering what remained of the morning peace. "Stay down," Jake shouted from his position on the roof of the boarding house. His rifle cracked steadily, each shot carefully placed. Elizabeth had never seen him like this, the quiet rancher transformed into something primal and deadly, defending what was his. Crane's men had expected easy prey, a town that would fold at the first show of force. Instead, they met the fury of people defending their home. The blacksmith's shotgun boomed from the livery stable. Even mild-mannered Samuel, the boy who'd first helped Elizabeth, was loading rifles for his father with grim determination. A rider broke through their line, charging straight for Elizabeth's position. She saw his face, clearly young, desperate, probably no older than she was. Time slowed as she raised her weapon, Jake's words echoing in her mind. "Anyone can pull a trigger. The question is whether you can live with what comes after." She fired. The rider tumbled from his saddle, his momentum carrying him past her barricade to sprawl in the dust. Elizabeth stared at what she'd done, bile rising in her throat. But there was no time for horror. More riders were coming, and the battle was far from over. "The livery!" someone shouted. Smoke was rising from the stable. Crane's men had managed to set it ablaze. The horses inside screamed in terror, and without thinking, Elizabeth ran toward the flames. She couldn't let innocent animals die for her choices. "Elizabeth, no!" Jake's voice cut through the chaos, but she was already yanking open the stable doors. Heat blasted her face as she plunged inside, the smoke thick and choking. She could hear the horses panic, could feel their terror matching her own. Working by touch and instinct, she unlatched stall doors, slapping flanks to drive the animals toward safety. A beam crashed down behind her, showering sparks. The smoke was getting thicker, her lungs burning with each breath. Then strong hands grabbed her, hauling her bodily from the inferno. Jake dragged her into the clean air, both of them coughing and gasping. "You trying to get yourself killed?" he growled, but his hands were gentle as they checked her for injuries. Before she could answer, A new sound cut through the battle. The sheriff's whistle, followed by his booming voice. "Luther Crane, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Elizabeth blinked smoke tears from her eyes to see an impossible sight. Riders were pouring in from the north and south, not Crane's men, but territorial marshals, their badges glinting in the firelight. The sheriff had somehow managed to get word to the authorities, and they'd responded in force. The battle shifted quickly, caught between the town's defenders and legitimate lawmen. Crane's hired guns began throwing down their weapons, but Crane himself wasn't finished. Elizabeth saw him break from cover, running not away but toward her, his face twisted with fury. "If I can't take you back alive," he snarled, raising his pistol. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Crane jerked like a marionette with cut strings, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. He collapsed in the dust, dark stains spreading across his shirt. Elizabeth turned to see Jake lowering his rifle, his face carved from stone. Behind him, the sheriff and Mrs. Dottie also held smoking weapons. "Nobody threatens our people." "Mrs." Dottie said calmly, as if she hadn't just shot a man. "Nobody." The aftermath was swift and decisive. The surviving members of Crane's gang were arrested by the territorial marshals. The fire was brought under control before it could spread beyond the livery, and Harold Morrison's ambitions died with Luther Crane in the dust of Main Street. But the cost had been high. 2 townsmen were dead, and Jake had taken a bullet in the shoulder during the fight. Elizabeth found herself in Mrs. Dottie's kitchen, cleaning and binding his wound with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Hold still," she muttered, trying to focus on the task and not the fact that he could have died protecting her. "I've had worse," Jake said, though his face was pale beneath his tan. "You did good out there. Saving those horses, that was brave." "That was stupid," Elizabeth corrected. "You said so yourself." Brave and stupid aren't mutually exclusive. His good hand covered hers where it rested on his shoulder. "Elizabeth." She looked up to find his gray eyes intense on hers. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only this kitchen, this man, this moment balanced on the edge of something inevitable. "I'm not Mary," she said quietly. "I can't replace what you lost." "I'm not asking you to," Jake replied. "Mary's gone, and I'll carry that grief until I die. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You make me remember that I'm still alive, that there might be something beyond just surviving each day." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Then bootsteps on the porch shattered it. The sheriff entered, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he addressed Elizabeth, "the marshals want to take your statement. And there's this—" He handed her a telegram. "Came through this morning, before all the excitement." Elizabeth read it with trembling hands. Harold Morrison was dead a heart attack upon receiving news of Crane's failure. Her father had disowned her publicly to save face. She was free, but also truly alone, cut off from everything she'd known. "I'm sorry," the sheriff said awkwardly. "I know it's a lot to take in." After he left, Elizabeth sat staring at the telegram. Freedom, it seemed, came with its own weight. She'd wanted to escape her old life, and now it was gone entirely, severed as cleanly as if cut with a knife. "Regrets?" Jake asked softly. Elizabeth considered the question. She thought of the woman she'd been pampered, protected, purposeless. Then she looked at her hands, scarred now from work and combat, steady despite all they'd done. She thought of the town that had risked everything to protect her, of the home she'd found in this unlikely place. "No," she said finally. "No regrets." Outside, Bitter Creek was already beginning to rebuild. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as the livery was repaired. Women emerged from the mine with children in tow, ready to reclaim their homes. Life in the territories didn't pause for long, even after bloodshed. Elizabeth helped Jake to his feet, supporting him as they walked to the door. The sun was high now. burning away the smoke and shadows of battle. Main Street bore the scars of violence, bullet holes in wood. Dark stains in the dust, but the town endured, as it always had. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Now we rebuild. We go on. We live." He paused, looking down at her. "Together. If you'll have me. I'm not offering you an easy life. Elizabeth, the ranch is hard work, and I'm not an easy man to live with. But I'm offering you a partner, if you want one." Elizabeth thought of the fortune-teller's words that had once seemed so strange. Never expect the cowboy rode straight into her bed. But it wasn't about physical desire. She understood now. It was about two damaged souls finding each other in an unlikely place, choosing to build something new from the ashes of their pasts. "Yes," she said simply, as they stood together in the doorway, watching Bitter Creek rise from another trial. Elizabeth felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer the virgin bride running from a loveless match. She was Elizabeth Smith, soon to be Elizabeth Thornton, a woman who had faced fire and lead and won her place in this harsh land. The transformation was complete, and her real life, the one she'd chosen and fought for, was just beginning. The aftermath of battle hung over Bitter Creek like smoke from a dying fire. As the sun climbed toward noon, the true cost became clear in the harsh light. Tom McKenna, the cooper who'd taught Elizabeth how to judge good barrel wood, lay beneath a blood-stained canvas outside his shop. Young Daniel Briggs, barely 19 and full of dreams about heading to California, would never see the Pacific now. Their bodies awaited the undertaker's attention while their widows wept behind closed doors. Elizabeth knelt in the dust beside Jake, who sat propped against a wall while Doc Hartwell worked to extract the bullet from his shoulder. Jake's face was gray with pain, but his eyes remained fixed on the activity around them, townspeople cleaning up debris, territorial marshals taking statements, children peering out from behind their mothers' skirts with wide, frightened eyes. "Two good men dead," Jake said through gritted teeth as the doctor probed the wound. "Because of—" "Don't," Elizabeth interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare say it's because of me. It's because of Harold Morrison's greed and Luther Crane's violence. Tom and Daniel died defending their home. Honor that, don't diminish it." Doc Hartwell grunted approval as he extracted the bullet with a wet sound that made Elizabeth's stomach turn. "The lady's right," he said, dropping the lead into a metal pan. "I've lived in Bitter Creek for 15 years. We've faced down claim jumpers, Apache raids, and drought. This is what we do. We stand together. Those boys knew what they were fighting for." As the doctor bandaged Jake's shoulder, Sheriff Watson approached with several territorial marshals. The lead marshal, a weathered man named Josiah Mills, tipped his hat to Elizabeth. "Ma'am, I'll need your full statement about what transpired here," he said. "The truth now, I've got 2 dead townsmen and 6 dead gunmen. That requires explanations." Elizabeth stood, squaring her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "My name is Elizabeth Whitfield," she began, the Boston name feeling foreign on her tongue. 3 months ago, I fled an arranged marriage to Harold Morrison." She told it all: the escape, the journey west, finding sanctuary in Bitter Creek. The marshals listened without interruption, occasionally exchanging glances. When she finished, Mills nodded slowly. "Morrison's dead, Crane's dead, and you're a legal adult who committed no crime by refusing marriage." He summarized. "Far as the law's concerned, this matter's closed. The attack on the town is another issue, but that's on Crane's head, not yours." Relief flooded through Elizabeth, but it was short-lived. As the marshals moved away, she became aware of the townspeople's stares. Some were sympathetic, others curious, but a few held accusation. She heard the whispers starting. 2 men dead, brought trouble to our door. That Boston woman. Mrs. Dottie appeared at her elbow, eyes flashing. "Don't you pay them no mind," she said loudly enough for the whisperers to hear. "Small minds always need someone to blame when the world gets violent. They'll remember the truth soon enough." But the damage was spreading like ripples in water. At Tom McKenna's house, his widow emerged, her face ravaged by grief. Her eyes found Elizabeth across the street, and the look in them was like a physical blow. Without a word, she turned and went back inside, slamming the door. "She doesn't mean it," Jake said quietly, leaning heavily on Elizabeth as she helped him toward the boarding house. "Grief makes people cruel sometimes." That evening, as Elizabeth helped serve dinner to the remaining boarders, the dining room was quieter than usual. Conversations died when she entered, resuming in hushed tones after she left. The easy camaraderie she'd built over months of hard work seemed to evaporate like morning dew. After the meal, she found herself alone in the kitchen, mechanically washing dishes while tears ran silently down her cheeks. This was what she'd feared all along, that her presence would bring destruction, that the peace she'd found would crumble, that she would always be the outsider who brought death in her wake. Self-pity doesn't suit you. She turned to find Jake in the doorway, his arm in a sling but his eyes clear. He moved carefully to lean against the counter beside her. "2 men are dead because of me," she said. "Their wives are widows. Their children are fatherless. How am I supposed to live with that?" "The same way I live with not being there when Mary died," Jake replied, with difficulty, with guilt, but also with the understanding that we don't control other people's choices. Crane chose violence. Tom and Daniel chose to fight. You chose to stay and stand with us. Each person owns their choices. Now the town blames me. Some do, Jake acknowledged. Others are grateful you gave them something worth fighting for besides their own petty concerns. Unity comes hard to places like this. Sometimes it takes a catalyst. Elizabeth returned to the dishes, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. "I should leave. Take my curse elsewhere." Jake's good hand covered hers, stilling her frantic scrubbing. "Is that what you want to run again?" She thought of the telegram in her pocket, officially severing her ties to Boston. She thought of the skills she'd learned, the strength she'd found, the home she'd begun to build. Most of all, she thought of the man beside her, offering partnership despite his own grief. "No," she admitted, "but wanting to stay doesn't make it right." "Right and wrong get complicated out here," Jake said. "What's right is that you've become part of this town. What's right is that we protected our own. The rest is noise that'll fade with time." A knock at the door interrupted them. Samuel peered in, his young face serious. "Mrs. Smith." "Ma'am, Mrs. McKenna's asking for you." Elizabeth's heart clenched. She looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly, then followed Samuel through the darkening streets to the Cooper's house. The widow sat on her porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the evening warmth. "Sit," Anna McKenna said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "I need to say something." Elizabeth sat, bracing for condemnation. Instead, Anna reached out and took her hand. "Tom told me about you," she said quietly. "How you worked to earn your place here. How you never complained. Never acted above anyone. He said you were becoming a true woman of the territories." Her grip tightened. "I was angry earlier. Needed someone to blame, but Tom died doing what he believed in, protecting folks who needed it. Don't dishonor that by running. Don't let his death mean nothing." The tears came then, for both women. They sat together as stars emerged overhead, grieving what was lost while holding tight to what remained. Later, walking back through town, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes: a nod from the blacksmith, a gentle smile from the preacher's wife, the bartender raising his glass slightly as she passed. Not everyone had forgiven her presence, might never forgive it, but enough had chosen grace over blame. At the boarding house, she found Jake waiting on the porch despite Doc Hartwell's orders to rest. "Well," he asked. "The town's divided," Elizabeth reported. Some will always see me as the cause of their loss. Others, she thought of Anna McKenna's tear-stained benediction. Others understand that sometimes trouble comes whether we invite it or not. And you, what do you see? Elizabeth considered the question, looking out over the town that had sheltered her, fought for her, bled for her. I see a place that's earned my loyalty, whatever the cost. I see people who deserve better than having me run at the first sign of hardship. She met his eyes. I see a future worth fighting for, even if it comes with pain. Jake's smile was small but real. Then we rebuild, together. The next morning, Elizabeth rose early and made her way to the cemetery on the hill outside town. 2 fresh graves marked the newest additions to Bitter Creek's growing population of the dead. She knelt between them, placing wildflowers she'd gathered from the desert. I'm sorry, she whispered to the wooden markers. I'm sorry you died in a fight that wasn't yours, but I promise your sacrifice won't be wasted. I'll stay. I'll help your families. I'll be worthy of what you gave. The wind carried her words away across the desert, and with them, some of her guilt. She would carry the weight of their deaths always, but she would carry it forward, not let it drag her back. Rising, she saw other figures approaching townspeople coming to pay their respects. Some nodded to her, others looked away, but all came to honor the fallen. She stood with them as the preacher said words over the graves, part of the community in grief as she had been in battle. Justice in Bitter Creek had always been rough, written more in lead than law, but it was justice nonetheless. And Elizabeth Smith, the virgin bride transformed by desert and trial, would stand witness to it, come what may. The desert bloomed after the September rains, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost gentle. Purple sage and golden brittlebush painted the valleys while organ pipe cacti displayed their white flowers like peace offerings to the sky. It had been 6 weeks since the battle, and Bitter Creek was slowly healing both its buildings and its people. Elizabeth stood at the window of Jake's ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The simple gold band on her finger still felt foreign, though they'd been married for 2 weeks now. The ceremony had been small, held in the rebuilt section of the church, with Mrs. Dottie standing as her witness and the sheriff as Jake's. Not everyone in town had attended, but enough had come to show that acceptance was growing like the desert flowers slowly but surely. Coffee's ready, Jake said from behind her, his arm now free of the sling, though he still moved carefully. The wound had healed clean, leaving another scar to join his collection. Each mark on his body told a story of survival, just as hers did now. She turned to smile at him, still marveling at how different he looked when happiness softened the harsh lines of his face. I was thinking about hiring the Briggs boy to help with the cattle, she said, accepting the steaming cup. Daniel's younger brother. The family could use the income, and we need the hands. Jake nodded approvingly. You're learning to think like a rancher's wife, though, he added with a slight smile. Most ranchers' wives don't insist on riding out to check the fences themselves. Most ranchers' wives didn't learn to shoot from Jake Thornton, Elizabeth countered. Besides, I spent too many years in drawing rooms. I'm not about to trade one cage for another, even if this one has a better view. They worked side by side through the morning, mending fences and checking water sources. The ranch wasn't large. Jake had let it shrink after Mary's death, but there was potential here. Elizabeth could see it in the good grazing land, the reliable water, the sturdy buildings that just needed care and attention to thrive again. As they paused to rest in the shade of a cottonwood, Jake studied her with those storm-gray eyes that still made her pulse quicken. Any regrets? He asked, echoing his question from weeks before. Elizabeth considered, looking down at her hands brown now from the sun, calloused from work, steady as they'd never been in Boston. I regret the cost, she said honestly. Tom and Daniel, the pain brought to their families, but regret the choices that brought me here, no. Never. Good. Jake said simply, "Because I've got something to tell you, and I need to know you're committed to this life." Elizabeth's heart skipped. "What is it?" "Sheriff Watson stopped by yesterday while you were in town. There's been trouble up north. Apache raids pushing settlers south. He thinks we might see an influx of folks looking for safer territory. Bitter Creek could grow from a way station to a real town. But it'll mean changes, progress, the kind that doesn't always sit well with old-timers." "And you," Elizabeth asked, "how do you feel about progress?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out over the land that had been his refuge and his prison for 3 years. "I think maybe it's time to stop living in the past," he said finally. "Mary wouldn't want me to keep this place as a shrine. She'd want it to live, to grow, maybe even—" He paused, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Maybe even hear children's voices again someday." The words hung between them, precious and fragile as spun glass. Elizabeth reached out, taking his hand. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A future built on something besides running and fighting, though," she added with a wry smile, "I suspect the territories will always require both." They rode back to the house as afternoon shadows grew long, discussing plans expanding the herd, possibly adding horses, maybe even trying some of the new farming techniques Elizabeth had read about in magazines from back east. It was good to talk about the future instead of merely surviving the present. As they crested the final ridge before home, they saw a rider waiting by the gate. Elizabeth's hand went automatically to her weapon, old habits dying hard. But Jake relaxed. "It's young Samuel," he said, "probably with a message from town." Indeed. The boy held a letter, which he handed to Elizabeth with a shy smile. "From Mrs. Dottie, ma'am. She said to tell you it's good news." Elizabeth opened it there in the saddle, Jake reading over her shoulder. It was brief, but made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Dear Elizabeth, the town council met last night, voted to officially commend you and Jake for your defense of Bitter Creek. Also voted to name you as the new school teacher. If you're willing, the children need learning, and we need someone who understands that strength comes in many forms. The pay isn't much, but the respect is real. Think about it. Your friend, Dottie P.N." Anna McKenna seconded the motion. "Healing happens. Child, give it time." "A teacher," Jake mused. "The woman who rode into town running from everything, now shaping the next generation, there's poetry in that." Elizabeth folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket next to the telegram that had severed her old life. 2 pieces of paper, 1 ending, 1 beginning. "I'll do it," she said. "These children deserve to know there's a world beyond the territories, even if they choose to stay." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The frightened girl in the wedding dress seemed like someone from a story now, distant and almost mythical. The virgin bride who rode into town to escape love had discovered something far more complex and real than the fairy tales of her youth. "Jake," she said into the comfortable silence, "do you remember what you told me that first day, about belonging being a choice to stay when things get hard?" "I remember," he replied, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I understand it now. It's not about the place accepting you, it's about choosing the place, over and over, even when it hurts, even when it costs everything. Especially then." Jake agreed. "The easy choices don't forge us into who we're meant to be. It's the hard ones, the ones that scar us and shape us, that matter." A coyote called in the distance, answered by another, their wild song echoing across the desert. Once, that sound had frightened Elizabeth. Now it was simply part of the night music, along with the wind in the mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier now, though still precious for their rarity. "Not because you saved me, but because you let me save myself." Jake turned to her, his scarred face soft in the starlight. And I love you, Elizabeth Thornton. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Because you chose to stand and fight instead of run and hide. They sat together as the night deepened. Two souls who had found each other across loss and violence, building something new from the ashes of their pasts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, always did in the territories. There would be more storms to weather, more battles to fight, more losses to endure. But there would also be sunrises painting the mountains, children to teach, crops to tend, and quiet moments like this when the world felt vast and full of possibility. The Virgin Bride story had ended in gunfire and grace. Elizabeth Thornton's story was just beginning, written in the everyday courage of frontier life, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, in the love that grows not despite hardship but because of how two people face it together. In the distance, Bitter Creek slept under its blanket of stars, scarred but surviving, growing stronger for having been tested. And in a ranch house on the edge of tomorrow, two people who had learned that sometimes the only way to escape a cage is to build a home, held each other close and dared to dream of the future. The desert wind carried their quiet laughter across the sage, a sound as wild and free as the land itself. Some stories end with happily ever after. This one ended with something better. Hopefully ever after. Built one sunrise at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Elizabeth and Jake's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Please comment below and let me know. I love connecting with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, romance, and adventure from the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Elizabeth's transformation and what part of the story resonated most with you. Until next time, partners.